Hi, thanks very much, everyone. Um, okay, um, any time in the next few weeks, possibly very soon, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, EHRC, will publish its inquiry into allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And it's possible, likely, that the EHRC will find that unlawful acts, in quotes, have been committed by the party under the Equality Act of 2006, and that the party has unlawfully discriminated against, harassed, or victimized people because they are Jewish. It might have a finding somewhat short of that, but in any event, the judgment will be quite devastating for the Labour left, and of course represents the latest stage in a campaign that served to, from 2016 on, and particularly after 2017, served to isolate Corbyn's core support within Labour and played a critical role in derailing his radical political project. And furthermore, the repercussions have been felt beyond Labour, crucially in silencing Palestinian voices and suppressing Palestine solidarity. And in this discussion, I want to address three issues, really. One, the question of freedom for Palestine. Secondly, the conflation, the false conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And thirdly, to look at the dynamic, the relationship between anti-Semitism and the question of Zionism. So first of all, in Palestine, the Palestinian people are facing an escalating assault on their human rights and their struggle for freedom. In a long history of betrayal by Arab regimes, the United Arab Emirates just very recently recognized Israel and secured trade deals in the wake of that, giving further confidence, without question, to Netanyahu in stepping up the process of ongoing dispossession of the Palestinian people. It has to be said that for many Palestinians, the question of annexation, supposedly postponed in the wake of the UAE deal, is their day-to-day reality in all but name. Ever since the Oslo peace deal of 1993, Palestinians have suffered an intensification of ethnic cleansing and dispossession, the suppression of human rights, house demolitions, the seizure of Palestinian land and resources, and the violence of an armed settler movement backed by the Israeli Defense Force. But I want to address the significance, the wider significance of Palestine, because it's starkly evident, isn't it, that that Israel commands the backing and support from our own governments, from the US, Britain, the European Union and others. US military aid to Israel is at an all-time historic high, and that is saying something. And one has to ask why Israel secures this support. It's not out of concern, I would argue, for Jews as Jews. In the case of Trump, this is laughable. Trump routinely deploys anti-Semitism as part of a fake anti-establishment rhetoric against globalists, international finance, and supporters of refugee and migrant rights, amongst others. I think it has to be explained by the importance of a fortress Israel in the Middle East. particularly since the 2000s, the Second Intifada, the disastrous invasions and military interventions across the region, the civil wars, the regional rivalries, and the waves of refugees in tens of millions, and not least the Arab revolutions of 2011, all mark a crisis of imperialism in the Middle East. And so, however brutal in its treatment of the Palestinians, however openly racist the character of the government and the state, our governments will continue to lend Israel support and attack Israel's critics and the Palestine solidarity movement here at home. But there is another side to the picture. The cause of Palestinian freedom is a lightning rod, has acted as a lightning rod for struggles for freedom and against oppression and inequality across the globe. Palestine inspired those struggling against apartheid in South Africa. It inspires activists in the Black Lives Matter movement. Palestine was a cause at the heart of the great international anti-war movement after 2003. And the Palestinian flag waved above the Arab revolutions of 2011. And I think one of the reasons we have to understand about this is that in any fight against injustice, the question of where the roots of oppression lie is raised, so as to understand how they can be overcome. And here there is a connection between Black Lives Matter protesters in Portland or Ferguson, the mass protests against war, Muslim communities resisting Islamophobia, the revolts in the Middle East, and the Palestinian struggle. Because in all these, those resisting oppression, fighting for equality, find themselves facing the same foes. So however brutal the repression of the Palestinian struggle, however aggressive the attempt to silence Palestine solidarity, the foundations of resistance remain. And upon those foundations, the struggle continues to resurface, to haunt those who seek to crush it. And here socialists play a critically important role. Important, first of all, in campaigning over Palestine and boycott, divestment and sanctions and so forth. But also crucially in bringing struggles together and rooting socialist and revolutionary organization where ordinary people have the power to achieve a transformation of society in their own name, and not least as part of that, the cause of Palestine. I want to turn to the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because the attack on the Labour Party and the wider left has rested on, centrally, on a false conflation, but the conflation of opposition to Zionism and criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Zionism has existed not least amongst Jews ever since Zionism emerged as a political ideology in the later 19th century. It is an ideology that has been used to justify the dispossession of the Palestinians since the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. It has meant ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and illegal occupation. But many Jews opposed Zionism from its beginning, and many still do so. There's nothing inherent in being Jewish that makes you a Zionist. Not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. And nor, I would argue, does Zionism or the State of Israel protect Jews from the real roots of anti-Semitism. And that is a growing question today. So it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. It is not anti-Semitic to describe the State of Israel as a racist apartheid state. And we have to stand up against the smears that it is. And this conflation marks a narrative of what's called the new anti-Semitism that's being used beyond a defense of Israel, but as a defense of the system and against challenges to it. And I want to therefore turn to how the left should respond. First, I'd argue we need a socialist politics grounded in opposition to all oppression and imperialism, and that includes anti-Semitism. We are witnessing the re-emergence of anti-Semitism as a weaponizing ideology of the far right, the fascists and white supremacist movements. It pervades the conspiracy theories such as QAnon that attempt to construct fantastical explanations of a system in crisis. And anti-Semitism, like any form of racism, is a reactionary ideology. It developed in its modern form as an ideological defense of capitalism, nationalism, and militarism against emerging socialist movements in the 19th century. In Tsarist Russia, it was used to mobilize pogroms in response to the threat of revolution. It was an ideology that reached its ultimate expression in the Nazi Holocaust. But there is an argument that anti-Semitism somehow has a natural home on the left as well as the right, somehow flowing from a critique of the capitalist system and the drive for profit, from an analysis of an international ruling class, or from anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. And this we have to reject. This is not to say that anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism and prejudice, cannot permeate the left. It can, and it does. Reactionary ideas are not simply a trick or a device. They can adopt an independent life of their own and appear to offer a defense of individual interests amongst some workers against those of other workers. And in the case of anti-Semitism, a distorted, if fantastical, explanation of systemic crisis. However, these reactionary ideologies rely on diverting away from the systemic character of the capitalist system and displacing, diverting class antagonisms. Anti-Semitism therefore lays the blame for systemic capitalist crisis on an alien, hostile community, the Jew, assumed to harbor within itself all the malign ills of capitalism. And at certain times, anti-Semitism has had purchase on elements of the left and movements of the oppressed. However, they do not arise naturally from such movements. They reflect an accommodation with the system. They serve to undermine solidarity in the struggle against exploitation and oppression, and act as a bulwark against the possibility of social transformation. So the argument is not that working class movements and movements of the oppressed are immune, but that there exists an objective and material basis for challenging the hold of reaction and rooting out its influence by posing a socialist class alternative. It's not automatic. It requires politics and organization on the part of socialists to contest influence of reactionary ideas. However, there is a material reality for doing so, and this is not true for those who seek to defend a system based on exploitation, oppression, and war. Hence, reactionary ideas overwhelmingly prevail on the right, and it is there, not on the left, that anti-Semitism finds its natural home. And this is important for us today. As far-right and fascist movements have grown, so has their use of anti-Semitism as a tool to explain the crisis of the system. And it would be a mistake for the left to be diverted from that threat. Finally, I want to address how the left should respond to the influence of Zionist ideas So not so much the Zionist project in Israel, but the wider influence of Zionist ideas. First of all, I want to argue that a left response has to take account of the character of Zionism as a political ideology and its influence. It's true that Zionism serves as a defense of an apartheid racist state in Israel, and the tradition in which the SWP stands holds the state of Israel to be a settler colonial project, and that peace and equality between Jews and Palestinians rests on a one-state solution and the right of Palestinians to return. However, the wider influence of Zionism is not reducible to its role in underpinning Israel. It is the case that the majority of Jews outside Israel, and indeed much of the left, express an affinity with the state of Israel and, to differing degrees, accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state. And here it's important to just register that Zionism emerged as a response to anti-Semitism. In the late 19th century, it was a minority movement, heavily contested within European Jewry. But that situation was transformed increasingly during the 20th century, but particularly after the Holocaust, as Zionists were able to project a Jewish state as the ultimate sanctuary from anti-Semitism and genocide. So in broad anti-racist movements, we will include, this is particularly clear in America, by the way, will include Jews and non-Jews who see a Jewish state as a legitimate response to anti-Semitism, and those who oppose Israel and Zionism. And the job of socialists is to build unity while maintaining a principled position over the question of Palestine, while arguing that true sanctuary from anti-Semitism lies in the unity of the oppressed, in opposition to colonialism and imperialism, and not in a settler colonial state. And it's interesting, see, it's not coincidental that in the US, we see fractures opening up within US Jewry. Prominent liberal figures who have been long-standing tribunes of a two-state solution are now arguing that it's been buried, it's over. In part, this reflects a reaction to realities in Israel and the Middle East, but also, I believe, it reflects the mobilization of sections of US Jewry against Trump, the far right, and their naked anti-Semitism. So the left needs to be wary of traps exacerbated by the hostilities of the witch hunt and the frustration over the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn. The fact that right-wing Zionists reference anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in their attacks on the left cannot be a reason for our diminishing in any way their significance. And I think there was a recent intervention by the pro-Palestinian scholar Norman Finkelstein, I think reflected this problem in his muddying the waters over Holocaust denial and the role of Holocaust denier David Irving. I think the answer to this is to ground a defense of the left and the cause of Palestinian freedom in a socialist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist politics, and to locate those politics in wider social struggles. It is in those struggles, I would argue, that a revolutionary alternative that has the potential to transform society can be begun to be built, with a vision of a society that's free of national oppression, racism, anti-Semitism, exploitation and war, and in which Palestine can be free.
Great, thanks Rob, that was fantastic. Some fantastic, interesting points. So as I said at the beginning, I'm going to open up now to questions, comments. And if you remember, if you want to speak, can you indicate by clicking on the participants button, finding yourself, and then using the raise hand button. So over to you, comrades. Right, Andy.
Hi, it's Pearl.
Hi, Pearl.
Hiya. Just to say that the Labour Party has developed a quite a worrying precedent by making us think that if you even mention Israel or criticise Israel in some way, that you're being anti-Semitic, which is what it's like in the Labour Party. You listen to Labour Party people talking and they hardly dare mention Israel. But one thing that I'd like to ask is, in terms of the two-state solution, we're arguing that it should be a one-state solution, but I really can't, I don't know how that's going to happen. I mean, I know there are people in Israel that don't support Zionism, that don't even support the government. But to me, it seems that a two-state solution would be best, and then to argue for a one-state. But I think, to me, it seems that the only chance is a two-state solution.
Okay, thanks, Pearl. Tamsin?
Regarding the QAnon right-wing conspiracy stuff, we have had to challenge this a lot in our SUTR group chat. We've kind of assembled a collection of articles and a video so that we can keep challenging it, because it has come up now 3 or 4 times. And we've been quite quick on it. And again, if anybody has this as an issue, we can supply you with articles from a variety of organisations and media outlets that challenge it and that explain that it's a conspiracy theory and that it is anti-Semitic. And you know, the stuff about people stealing children and then devouring them is it's very anti-Semitic. It's to do with, I think, what they call the blood libel, which goes back centuries, doesn't it? Which I don't know enough about, to be fair, but I know that it's anti-Semitic. There was something, oh, that's it, I was going to say about Israel. I remember reading many years ago The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Papp, that's it. He still does meetings with the party. And one of the chapters in it was about, I think it was about Haifa, but I'm struggling to remember certain details. I think it was about Haifa, and it was about there being a integrated labour movement in Haifa. Both Jews and Palestinians worked together, and you know, in that sense, it was quite a, it was a good city in that sense, because people were, there was working class unity, is what I'm trying to say. But that was ended by one of the Israeli militias throwing a bomb into a bus queue, and then began the decline of the integrated labour movement. So what I'm trying to say is, with a two-state or one-state solution, the one-state solution is the better one, because, people can unify, within their class. They can work together. There is a precedent for that. But also, I know the party's not a fan of Chomsky, and I've said this kind of thing before, but Chomsky, in one of his books, probably in several of them, does explain why a two-state solution wouldn't work, aside from the issue of, that removes the right of Palestinians to return. That's one of the main issues. But one of the others is that I think it's the West Bank that he explains is intersected by, in 3 major locations, probably more now because the book's probably 20 years old, but is intersected by pieces of Israeli infrastructure, roads, pipelines and things like that, which the Israelis would want to protect in the event of the West Bank becoming an independent state. And that would mean, checkpoints at these locations, and that would cause a lot of problems for any Palestinian state in that location. It would mean that it would be very much controlled by the Israeli state. So that, you know, really chucks out the idea of a two-state solution. That's not going to improve the situation for Palestinians. Whereas some kind of one-state solution and a anti-apartheid struggle, you know, hopefully you would get progress. I'm not always very clear, but thank you.
Cheers, Tamsin. We've got Mark next.
All right, can you hear me? Because this thing's not working out.
Yeah.
Sorry. Great meeting, Rob. I missed the first 10 minutes trying to get my bloody computer to work, but there we go. Not too bad. I want to sort of go off. Hi, Rob. You're right. You can hear me there. I just want to go off the rail a bit. I want to take on what Tamsin was saying about on the conspiracy stuff, and I think we should take a bit more serious than we are. We never took the attacks on anti-Semitism on Corbyn as serious, and the Labour Party didn't. Well, we've got the Friends of the Labour Party, Israel Friends of the Labour Party, obviously, so it's a bit more complicated and stuff like that. I was arguing with a friend about he's into conspiracy theories and about Marxism, trying to say no one controls the world. They believe there is a group of people who are controlling the world, and they're doing it to harm or whatever they do. They're trying a new world order. I don't know what they call themselves, whatever it is, a new world order. And I tried to explain Marx's theory to him, and he got a thing out and he said, oh, Marx is a distant relative of the Rothschilds, which he is, by the way, but a very long distant relative of the Rothschilds, because some Jewish conspiracy theory had proved this, you know what I mean? What I'm trying to get at is no one controls capitalism. There's no one group who controls capitalism. There's centers of power, I don't know, the New York Stock Exchange, Hong Kong, British, Wall Street, and whatever, certain international banks. But for a lot of people, it's very hard to grasp, isn't it, that there is no alternative. Capitalism controls us. We don't control it. We're living under its laws and its logic. And there's not one group of people that controls the system entirely. It's all like playing day by day, if you like. And for a lot of people, that's really hard to grasp, but really it is. So the conspiracy theory fits neatly in, you know, especially the Jewish idea, the Jewish banking system and stuff like that. Somehow someone or some group of people have to control the system and making them rules. And it could end up being really sinister. And this has been going on for quite a while. I don't know how to break that theory. That's how do you break alienation in one foul swoop? It's just impossible. Only a workers' revolution can do that. But we have to sort of like, I suppose we have to think, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the conspirators. Why are they thinking like this? What is something lacking in their understanding of the system? Why they would think about a Jewish conspiracy, or the elders of Zion has gone on from years ago, hasn't it? And this is not just now. We're talking about even in Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote about Shylock, didn't he, in The Merchant of Venice, and that sort of way. But I'd like to say, not in defense of Israel, but you could see that pull why they wanted a Jewish state. You could understand it. You know what I mean? We've also got to understand that as well, that the people are entitled to have some sort of safety in this world and having to like live freely in the way that they can. You know what I mean? So we've got to. I don't know, Rob. It's a difficult situation in terms of that. They have the right after the Holocaust to be free and feel to live safe. At the same time, we've got to take on the arguments of the conspiracies that are growing. It's a bit complicated for me to deal with at the moment, actually. So I'll leave it there. I'll just leave it open.
I think Andy had his hand up, but he's gone. So is he going to come back? Yeah. He's gone. No. Tamsin, I think you had your hand up.
I'm struggling to remember what I was going to say. This is happening at the minute. Right, one of the things is that I was going to say, is that I think it's easy to say it's a difficult argument. It's easy to say that capitalism isn't governed by anyone, but I'm just trying to find a quote in this book. It's that late Victorian Holocaust, and there's a bit in it where he says something about, you know, decisions are made by people. There's a tendency in books that support the free market to talk about the invisible hand of capital or something like that. And the writer contests that and says, no, these decisions are made by human beings. The decision to, you know, exploit a labour market where everyone's vulnerable, or there's you know, the decision to bomb Iraq and then privatise everything afterwards, that's a deliberate decision, you know, and that's not made by no one, and it's not made by the invisible hand of the free market. It's made by real people. But I think one of the other ways to perhaps look at it is I screenshot things sometimes off Facebook when they explain stuff, and Nigel, who's not here tonight, posts a lot of really interesting political stuff on his Facebook, and he's posted this about Gramsci. It's a quote of Gramsci, and he says, it's about ideology. So Gramsci's analysis supposes the existence of something which is truly total, but which is lived at such a depth and saturates society to such an extent, even constitutes the substance of and limit of common sense for most people under its sway, that it corresponds to the reality of their social experience. If ideology were merely some abstract imposed set of notions, and that goes back to something Rob said as well, you know, the right-wing conspiracy ideas are not just a set of ideas. They're something that's, you know, part of society, and even people at our end of the political spectrum can be influenced by them. They're you know, they have a real material basis for somebody, you know, for some reason. If our social and political, cultural ideas and assumptions and habits were merely the result of specific manipulation of a kind of overt training which might be simply ended or withdrawn, then the society would be very much easier to move and to change than in practice it has ever been. And that's Raymond Williams' Problems of Materialism, he says. But sometimes I think, you know, there's a certain amount to which deliberate decisions are made to, you know, carry out awful acts. Like I say, that's not some invisible hand. However, there is an underlying ideology to that which saturates society and perhaps leads those people making those terrible decisions to believe that there's a logic or a correctness to those decisions. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say.
Right, cheers, thanks Tamsin. Dave Allen. Dave, are you there? Have you unmuted?
This is like a seance. Is there anybody there?
No,
I know, I can't. Hiya, Dave.
I've been eating my tea, so it's the fingers are a bit sticky. Right, yes. If you think about it, if you're an ordinary member of the working class, you're brought up on these ideas of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. You work hard, you'll get on, all that sort of thing. And yet, the reality that people face is not that, is it? You know, this is the conspiracy we live under. The conspiracy that hides the real relationship in our society. You know, this idea that somehow we live in a meritocracy, and you know that there's equality of opportunity. These are all lies that are fed to us. And yes, some people get on, some people don't. But the reality is that if you look at the way capitalism operates, it operates. If you wanted to invent a conspiracy, you couldn't invent one better than, say, for example, the fact that this government has given millions and millions and hundreds of millions of pounds in contracts to their mates who have no experience for the jobs they're doing. They've cut out, for example, just on test and trace alone, they cut out the NHS and Public Health England from actually carrying, you know, the people who know this work, who do this work, from actually carrying out the test and trace process. Apparently it's devolved to something like 29 companies. It's just an insane amount, and it's all processed through one or two of the big, the big privatizers, the big people who get involved in doing public contracts, PPE, all the rest of it. So conspiracy is a very attractive way to look at the way the ruling class operates, because it actually does look like it is a conspiracy. Duncan Cummings and his mates in the back rooms sorting out the contracts for PPE, never mind the fact that 90% of what they produce turns out to be rubbish. There's nobody ever gets any punishment for that. They just get paid the money for it anyway. So it's very tempting, and it's why we need Marxism. You need a system that can actually break down what is really going on in society from what's being fed to us by the media, by schools, by just about every angle you look at it. So yes, that was just on conspiracy theories. Yes, sorry, enough of that.
Cheers, Dave. Got Patricia next. Are you there, Patricia?
Hi. Yeah, I am. Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Rob. That was brilliant, incredibly thorough. Last week we were answering questions, and we came upon, we discussed a comparison with the racism that we saw in South Africa to the racism that we see in Palestine. And one of the comrades explained that the reason why we managed with sanctions and protests was the power of the working class in South Africa to achieve change by strikes. Yeah, let's just picking up. Yeah, the actual imprisonment of activists as well, that was also a part of it, obviously, with Nelson Mandela and lots of other people. But when you're in Palestine, so many people have been in prison there. Wherever you go, they seem to have spent a period of time in jail. The thing is, it's not taking place now. The fight is not taking place effectively. That's my point. The routine is that land is stolen and illegal large settlement is set up with accompanying checkpoints and Israeli soldiers then on point to shoot. But the actual shootings are organised by a central body who will instruct the soldiers to shoot. Now, very often that's arbitrary shootings. I might drop a pen. And people will say, well, I'll say, well, why did they get shot? Or they did something wrong. I said, what do you mean do something wrong? And it could be just as simple as that, any movement. So I just feel the population is restricted to such an extent a movement can't, for instance, go to the capital or anything like it. The fabric of life there, the amount of psychological warfare is incredible, like the way they'll pick off people in the paramedics and make a point of shooting them because it'll have a powerful blow to morale. And that's what you come away with feeling from being there, is that this war is going on in the mind as much as the actual casualties, which are massive. I see all these, I saw on Facebook all the companies that are involved. I mean, the computer here, Hewlett-Packard, I didn't realise, I know now that I've actually got on the table that I can see you through, is a company that's involved in West Bank, Israel. So, yeah, I don't know, basically help me make some sense of this, because there's no sense. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Cheers, Patricia. Clive.
Yeah, this is not really directly related to Palestine. It's more about the Labour Party. Perhaps Rob can enlighten us as to what I see as the incredible naivety within the Labour Party. Corbyn got more votes in 2017 than Blair got in 2010. The number of votes that Corbyn was able to muster in the radical phase prior to the confusing position on Brexit, which I believe was their downfall in the election, nothing to do with anti-Semitism, did very well. Now, obviously, the huge growth of the Labour Party in that period was something that they should have rejoiced about. The fact is that Keir Starmer, in getting rid of Rebecca Lee-Bailey, has effectively signalled that he wants nothing to do with that left wing. The anti-Semitic so-called position that Rebecca Lee-Bailey was supposed to have been in, agreeing with a Twitter which said that the kneeling on George Floyd was taught to the American police by Israelis was absolute nonsense, especially as it was apologised and withdrawn anyway, and it was very flimsy evidence on which to go. When we talk about conspiracy theories, I mean, it's no accident that when Labour won elections, or Blair won elections, he did it with the backing of Rupert Murdoch. He went to meals, and when you talk about conspiracy theories, this is a great one, isn't it? You know, control the media and you're away. Now, what on earth makes Keir Starmer think that by pummeling the left, which undoubtedly rejuvenated the Labour Party as an organisation on the streets and acting on principle, is going to glean them more centre votes when the media quite obviously, I mean, from Kinnock, last one to leave, turn the lights out, was the headline in the newspaper there, to, you know, the mildness of Ed Miliband, who was tortured for the way he ate a bloody bacon sandwich. You know, they will find a way of mutilating the leader of the Labour Party, irrespective of what they do or what their policies are, if they don't get into bed with the media. Now, I just don't understand why the Labour Party can't see that, unless, and let's watch what happens, unless Keir Starmer has a full intention of swinging in behind the right-wing media.
Cheers, Clive. I don't think I've got anyone else with their hand indicating. Oh, Andy. Andy, I can see you waving.
Oh yeah, I can't put my hand up with the with this thing here. Just on conspiracy theory, I don't really want to talk about them, but I just think people who believe in conspiracy theories are not going to become activists, mostly. I think people who want to read and learn and think about things, conspiracy theory is a shortcut to explain the world without having to consider social movements and economic and political and military complications. And it's people who believe in that stuff are not going to do anything because it's not a reason to do anything. It's a reason to think it's all fixed anyway. I just wanted to ask the basic question, Rob, that Netanyahu is very unpopular. He's been in court for corruption charges. There's been quite large protests on the street, even very recently. As an organisation, the Socialist Workers' Party don't really have much faith in the role of the Israeli working class, the masses of Israeli people, to do anything progressive for the Palestinian cause. In the 80s, there were huge protests of Israeli people in support of peace, a vague term, but still, you know, very sizable, hundreds of thousands in a country of 5 or 6 million. That was quite a sizable protest. There's some on the left here who do think that the Israeli working class, the Israeli masses, are part of the solution. What do you have to say to that? Do we think of them as the white working class or the white masses in South Africa who play a reactionary role, or do we think there is a possibility for the Israeli people who do show at least some hostility to the leadership, the political leadership, But obviously things have drifted massively to the right in Israel over the last 30 years. The Labour Party is now not really even a player in Israel, and it's just a choice of appalling right-wing nationalisms and Zionisms that are available at election. That's me.
Okay. I'm going to bring Tony in.
What I wanted to say was something a bit more general, I think. And I think it's, you know, I was appalled at the lack of defence of the Labour Party's position and Corbyn's position by the Labour Party and other people within the Labour Party. And I think there's a really important reason for that we have to talk about. And it's exactly what Rob shows. You know, it's about our knowledge and understanding of politics. You know, and if we haven't got those politics and the research, the study, the information, the ideology, you know, that we have, if we don't have that, you don't have the confidence, you don't have the belief that you can stand up and argue back and fight back. And I don't think, you know, and I think it's more than that as well. I think it's about the structures you have, because you have to trust the comrades around you, the people with you. You have to stand and trust the political organisation or the group you are with. And I think we have that. And I think it's more than just about, you know, standing up and saying, I'm confident enough to criticise and make difficult comments about saying I can fight anti-Semitism and criticise Israel, because it doesn't just happen there. You know, I mean, there's always a trade union leader that will do the same. There's always a politician that will do the same. There'll be a police or an army commander that does the same. There will be, you know, a trade union leader easily does it. And they do it in all sorts of ways. They say, you don't work here. You're not in our factory. You're not in our union. You don't live round here. You're not a woman, or you're not part of our group. And they do it all the time. And I think, you know, I think that's just part of some of what this is all about. And if you don't have that confidence in your abilities, but more importantly in the politics that's all based on, then actually they will try that on any subject almost at any time to undercut and undermine us and prevent us from having an impact or for people to listen to our ideas.
Cheers, Tony. I've got people indicating to speak who've already spoken, so just want to encourage anyone who hasn't spoken to ask a question or make a comment. We've still got some time, and if not, I've got Mark, who was indicating, then Tamsin, then Trish. So Mark.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me yet? Yeah, I just want to challenge Andy's position on the conspiracy theories. They don't end up doing anything, and they don't do anything. What they did in late 1927, in the late 1920s, and into the 1930s, they managed to get millions of Germans to wear a uniform, and then they drove millions of people to the slaughter in the gas chambers. It started off as a conspiracy, and it developed into a mass active movement. So I think we can't underestimate it. We can't underestimate that power, that weakness of power that can drive people into believing conspiracies of that nature. That's why I understand Andy's point. It doesn't lead them to become socialist activists. You know, the self, organising from the self, you know what I mean, self-activity. But conspiracy will follow leaders. They will do that, and they become active in other ways. They get told. I mean, you can see it in America now, you know, and that's why Trump's appealing to that conspiracy QAnon, whatever they're called. He knows that, you know, that's. So we've got to be careful. I don't think we should underestimate it. That's what I'm saying. All right, I'll leave it there.
Tamsin.
Yeah, sorry, Andy, I'm also going to challenge you fraternally. In saying that they don't become activists, the conspiracy people, many of them are activists, and many of them are, in fact, our BLM activists, and that's why we have had to challenge this in our SUTR group chat. This is where, you know, a political explanation comes in, but also where a bit of optimism comes in. And I am not an optimist, for most of you who know me, but we have to believe that we can win people over, but we have to, you know, be fairly convinced of our arguments as to how to win them over, and we have to, you know, think about how to win people over. So when people are talking about, you know, I'm going on this Save Our Children demo, we have to think, right, the best way to deal with child trafficking is what? Well, it's to campaign for the rights of asylum seekers, and it's to campaign against war, which are what we do, not what the other groups do. The groups running the conspiracy theory demonstrations are not campaigning to support asylum seekers and are not campaigning against war. And these are questions that you can encourage activists going to those demos to ask. You know, ask those people, do they support the rights of unaccompanied migrants who can't get a status in this country? Do they oppose the wars that displace millions of people and orphan children and force them into the hands of traffickers? And if their answer is that they don't support those children and they don't campaign against war, then what are they really doing to save our children? So, you know, this is where we have to make the point that that's what we're doing. We're campaigning against war. We're organising the demonstrations and the activities to support asylum seekers and support them trying to win their rights. And that's why you should be active with us and not with the conspiracy people who will lead you down a right-wing rabbit hole.
Cheers, Tamsin. Got Trish and then Richard.
Hi, yeah, I was just thinking about part of the discussions triggered me to say something else about I'm just saying I've been trying without success to exhibit a window into Palestine on the ground. This is in the form of children's views, checkpoints, isolation, identity, etc. The freedom to visually express these major parts of children's lives. My point is that the anti-Semitism lobby is so powerful. When I applied to the Arts Council, Sheila Murdoch, we talked about the press, and it made me think she's actually on the board. You know, I just wonder if these factors are part of what happens. I mean, the speaker last week, for instance, said that we asked that we remove the question section because we discussed Israel and Palestine. You know, that's powerful because people have fear. They have fear that somehow it's going to somehow affect their career, their life. If they speak out against Israel, it's quite incredible what they've actually pulled off. Really, that, you know, we are muted, and that's a powerful force that suppresses the right to resist ethnic cleansing, racing, etc. That's carrying on, you know, as we speak. Apart from bombings and murder, you know, in Palestine. It's just my second and last contribution. Thanks.
Cheers, Trish. Richard.
Yeah, hi comrades. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. It's just my wireless isn't great. A fantastic meeting by Rob. I've got some questions really, Rob, about the state of the Labour Party, trade union movement and Palestinians, because what you say about people in the Labour Party definitely frightened about raising things about Palestine. I think Pearl said that. But the trade union movement is continuing to push support for Palestinian solidarity, or it is in Unite. I mean, you know, every branch gets a letter in our region telling them to instructing them to affiliate to Palestinian Solidarity Campaign. And there is on Monday at the TUC an online Zoom Palestinian Solidarity Campaign meeting with a host of general secretaries, right? And in a sense, I want to know, how do those two things compare? Though to me, I think, I think the trade union movement is driven by sort of the politics of two-statism, and therefore it thinks it's going to avoid being attacked as being anti-Semitic. That's what I think they're doing. but I think they're serious about genuine. I mean about wanting to defend Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, etc. I do think they're serious about it. They are. The people are, Unite sends people to Palestine every year. He sends a massive big trip. It pays for people to go, right? So it's serious about that. My last question really is, the unions were useless in defending Jeremy Corbyn when the Labour Party accepted the so-called international definition of anti-Semitism. My union, Unite, was part of that process at the same time as it's writing to all its branches to say affiliated to PSC, because they thought it would go away. Right? And if you remember, the TUC, after that was accepted, everybody got a Palestinian flag to wave. Every delegate was waving a Palestinian flag to show that we're not going away. What I want to know is, how is it time, or is it not yet time, that there needs to be a united front to oppose this use of anti-Semitism against as a weaponization? And by the way, I think you have to choose, when the fact that we need one doesn't necessarily mean it's the right time to create one, because it depends if other people are up for it, to be quite frank, right? But that's my question, Rob. Does that make sense, what I'm asking you? Because, yeah, I'll shut up then. That's fine. Cheers, comrades.
Cheers, Richard. Cheers, everybody. I'm going to ask Rob to come back now.
Okay, thanks. That was a really good discussion. That has, though, thrown up some quite challenging questions. I mean, that is in the nature of the topic, really. I'm going to try and address three. I've only got a couple of minutes on each, so do forgive me if I don't cover all the bases. Really, the Labour Party, the two-state solution and conspiracy theory. I'll start with the Labour Party. Look, I've got an article in Socialist, in the October issue of Socialist Review, which will be one of the more lengthy articles in the review, where I specifically deal with this question in some depth, and I can't do that in a couple of minutes here. But in a nutshell, really, to understand the dynamic of Corbyn's defeat, one has to understand two things about the Labour Party. First, that it is an electoral party that seeks to get a Labour government into Parliament, through which measures can be passed legislatively through the state machine and so on. It's an electoral party. This puts huge primacy, or the primacy, on the Parliamentary Labour Party, which, however many MPs it has, 150, 250, completely outweigh the weight of the membership. However big that membership is, it's the PLP and the trade union leadership that really outweigh it. And the question that strikes at the heart of the left every single time that the left attempts becomes a force is the question of unity, the question of the unity of the party. Because this isn't just a sort of moral question. For Corbyn this is why the anti-Semitism question was a rapier that struck at the heart of the Corbyn project for 4 years, time and time and time again. It's true, it was not the issue that undercut primarily Corbyn's electoral support. That was not its purpose. Its purpose was internal to the Labour Party, to cut away at the soft left and the centre, and to cut through onto the question of unity of the party. Because what Corbyn and his team confronted was, were they going to go to war with the entire PLP, barring a dozen or so MPs maybe, the entire trade union leadership, who, at the end of the day, even those who support Corbyn would not be prepared to see the PLP jettisoned, and of course the Labour Party machine. And the question really is not so much what the right did, because the right do what the right do. What the media did, that's what the media always do. What the establishment did, what big business did. It's what the Labour left could not, didn't do, or found themselves trapped and unable to do. And I think this is really at the heart of the question. There's a question about a related question, you know, why does Keir Starmer think he's going to get support? Well, you can say there's a bit of delusion, but I do have to remind you, so there is another question. Why is it that Corbyn lost support in 2019 relative to the Tories? Why did such key sections of the base crumble? But Keir Starmer is reasserting the dominance of the traditional dominance of the right wing in Labour to its kind of historic place, if you like. So I don't think he's delusional. There may be a degree to which that he's got expectations of their ability to win votes, which may well not materialise, but that's not the be all and end all for the right. It's to restore Labour as a party that is a broad church of right and left, but in which the right has a dominant position. I mean, there's other aspects that I can't go through here. Look, the two-state solution, Pearl, Patricia, and others raised this question. And I think Pearl asked, you know, and this is a common question, how is the one-state solution going to happen? You see, the problem is if you look at it simply internally within Israel. Although I have to say that Andy mentioned the Peace Now movement of the 1980s, which could put 100,000, 200,000 onto the streets over the war in Lebanon for peace. That's gone, and it's not coming back. The protests at the moment against Netanyahu are around 15,000 at the most, and they're very mixed politically. Not only that, but if you look at the opinion polls, when it comes to questions of do you think Israeli Arab citizens should be transferred out of Israel, you're talking about 40%. All the questions over racist attitudes to Arabs and Palestinians have gone into the stratosphere. And I think this points to something. You see, what we say about Israel, and not just us, the long-standing case amongst anti-Zionists, not least anti-Zionist Jews, about Israel, is that whatever its intention, whatever the intentions or the motives of those who went to Palestine before the Second World War, and who went after the Holocaust, including those who saw themselves as socialist Zionists like my father, who went in the 1930s, who joined the Haganah, whatever their motives, inevitably, this was a settler colonial project. I mean, when Ilan Pape talks about Haifa, in a way it was much worse than this. My father was in Haifa and talked about Haifa. He left Palestine because finally, on one day going into work on an orchard which still employed Arab labor, the organizer of the Haganah was standing at the gate with a club which he smashed round the head of the Palestinian and said, "No Arabs work here." And that was a process that was taking place across Palestine. No Arab labor, no Arab produce. And you've got to understand Israel as if you understand Israel as a settler colonial project, then something follows from that. There has never been a settler colonial project in history that has dissolved itself. South Africa, the South African working class were able to overthrow apartheid internally. That's not possible in Palestine. But what does happen in Palestine is that the continued resistance of the Palestinian people ignites and feeds into this wider struggles in the region against imperialism. And no struggle against Arab rulers can avoid the question of imperialism in the Middle East. At some point, it has to face that. And in facing that, it has to face the question of Zionism in Israel. Does this mean the destruction of the Jewish people in Israel? No, it doesn't. Any more than it should mean the destruction of white people in South Africa or anywhere else. I do not believe for one moment that it's impossible for a Jew and a Palestinian Jew and a Palestinian Arab to live side by side in peace and equality. There's nothing in human nature that stops this. It's the nature of settler colonialism that stops this. And if settler colonialism is removed, is no longer tenable, then we can see the opportunities and prospect for peace. And that's why a two-state solution seems on one level logical, but is naive in the extreme. I mean, what it's really premised on is the idea of separate and equal. I thought we got rid of that in segregation, the segregated South or apartheid South Africa. It's a myth. And you can see the reality of that, you know, you can see that myth playing out, if you like, in Israel, in Israel today. The final thing I'd just say about Israel, before just saying something about the conspiracy theories, I think Mark talked about Israel as a sanctuary after the Holocaust, which is absolutely true. There's no question about it. But the problem is, it's not a sanctuary, ultimately, because Israel's existence as a settler colonial state rests on the very forces of oppression, of war, and imperialism that throw up racism and anti-Semitism and throw up the very forces that led to the destruction of Jewry in the 1930s and the Second World War, which is why I always argue that the real sanctuary lies in a common fight against oppression of all forms, national oppression and racism, and the unity that solves. And I think you can see that beginning to play out, for example, most clearly in the United States. Today. Finally, just on conspiracy theory, which, I mean, it is challenging, isn't it? I mean, I've done these meetings now for quite a long time, and this is the first time, really, that this question has been thrown up in such length, and I think comrades are right. There is a clear reason for it. It's getting a purchase, it's getting a hold. That wasn't true even a couple of months ago, let alone 3 or 4 years ago. And I think to understand conspiracy theory, and this is true not least of anti-Semitism, in a world that seems inexplicable, where suddenly everything that seemed to have some certainty attached to it, whether your economic security, your savings, the house, stability in society, all starts to crumble, then in the absence of a coherent explanation of the system, of the systemic crisis itself, then irrational explanations appear rational, can acquire a rationality. And obviously the attack on the left and the isolation of socialist arguments leaves a vacuum in which these can grow even further. And I think anti-Semitism plays a particular role. And it's no accident that I don't think you can collapse QAnon with the far right in entirely, but it does feed into it. And there is a reason for this. Anti-Semitism weaponizes all the other prejudices. It's not necessarily the case, or it's not the case, that in Newham, if I go out on the street, I'm as likely to be attacked as a woman in a hijab. That's just not true. It's not. But for the far right, and I'll put it like this, you can have all sorts, the far right can express all sorts of vitriol against a boatload of Syrian migrants in the Channel. What they can't do is blame them, say that they're the ones who control and own the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or are responsible for the world economic crisis, right? And anti-Semitism provides both, in a sense, a spurious explanation for that, but also the idea that here is an enemy that has to be totally defeated, that has to be crushed, that requires violence, that makes democracy a sham. And therefore it feeds into fascism, it feeds into the far right, and it makes every foe an enemy to be destroyed. And therefore you see that role of violence come to the fore in terms of fascist and far right movements. I'll just finish with one thing from Hannah Arendt, who said that an ideology which has to persuade people and mobilize people can't choose its victim arbitrarily. And she argued that the key was not so much proving whether or not these ideas were fake or whether they were a forgery, as in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example, but why they were believed. This is the question. Why were they believed? And how do we create a situation that pulls people away from the need to thinking that they have to explain the world in such conspiratorial and reactionary ways? And that's about building a movement in all the ways that we've discussed, tonight, a movement where socialist explanations can start to get a deeper hold. Okay.